All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 3 for PPA 660, Organization Theory and Behavior. It's kind of hard to believe that after tonight's session, we'll be officially halfway through the course, but I'm sure after being in the cohort for over a year now, you're probably very comfortable with the 6-week format. And so you know just how quickly these courses tend to go by, but it's kind of shocking to know that we're halfway through as of the end of tonight's session. Thank you for your responses in the Canvas essay number 2, looking at the differences between public and a private organization. I thought they were well done, and I provided feedback to you on those. I did notice some trends, which is certainly understandable in terms of especially some of the differences between public and private organizations. A lot of people talked about the differences in funding streams, and the differences in funding streams really do have profound impacts upon organizations and what they do and their behaviors. You know, there's a good body of literature out there that talks about the reliance upon appropriations by public organizations means that there's less of an imperative placed upon efficiency as compared to a private organization where you're relying upon the results of your profits in order to remain in operation. So I think that is a big difference. A lot of people talked about, in terms of differences, a difference in recruitment and hiring between the public and the private sector. Some people talked about differences in terms of contracting out. Some people talked about differences in terms of planning, strategic planning. Some folks talked about some differences in functions. One of the differences that I saw that I thought was pretty compelling is the discussion of the differences in scope between public and private organizations, and just the enlarged scope of the environment of the public sector as compared to the environment for a private sector organization, the heterogeneity of the population that you are dealing with, heterogeneity of the environment itself is certainly much different in the public as compared to the private sector. So yeah, I thought everyone did a nice job talking about some of those differences and some of those similarities to just again underscore why private organization theories oftentimes are not entirely applicable in our public organizations. So thank you very much for that. Your next Canvas essay that is coming up due for next week is a discussion of the information from last week, looking at 2 aspects of Weber's theories that you see in your organization, 2 aspects of Frederick Taylor's theories that you see in your organization as well. So, you know, how does classic school manifest itself within your organization? Obviously, that Canvas essay will then help you build that section of your organizational analysis paper. So that's what we have coming up for our Canvas essay for next week. For tonight, what we're going to do is continue our discussion of the chronological trajectory of the organization theory literature. Last week, we devoted our attention to the classical school, its underpinnings, its primary theories. We talked about the threads that tie classical authors together. We talked about some of the differences between classical authors in terms of their areas of focus, structure versus work process. Now, tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to move into our neoclassical schools of thought. And that term neoclassical is kind of used, neoclassical writ large, in that it's used for any theories that came after the classical school. So these neoclassical theories, such as human relations, human resource management, systems theory, all these neoclassical theories that we're going to talk about were all developed as rejoinders and responses to the flaws that were identified in the classical school. So tonight we'll do human relations, and we'll also do human resource management. Now, you probably noticed then the Tompkins textbook, Tompkins kind of handles them differently. Human relations appears earlier in the textbook, human resource management appears later. And the reason for that is because of his chronological handling of the development of the schools of thought. Because HRM, human resource management, did develop later than human relations. For this class, though, we're going to talk about them tonight together just because they do have so much overlap And there are some differences, but there are a great number of similarities between human relations and human resource management theories. So we're going to kind of combine them together and talk about them both tonight. So we will do that in the first half of class. We'll then take a break. And then the second half of class, as always, we will do our breakout groups. All right. Sound good? Any questions or anything before we get into our coverage of HR and HRM? Okay. All right. Then where we usually start with our discussion of human relations school is usually with Mary Parker Follett. And I did provide a couple of readings on our Canvas site. I keep wanting to say Beachboard. On our Canvas site for you to kind of replace the missing Follett article from the new edition of the classics textbook. But what I want to do tonight is talk about in an overarching fashion what Follett thought about organizations and how Follett's perspective on organizations really differed substantially from the perspectives of Weber, Taylor, and other classical theorists. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about Mary Parker Follett, they will not include her as a human relations theorist. And indeed, in the Tompkins textbook, he has an entire chapter called Pre-Human Relations Theory that's devoted to Mary Parker Follett. And chronologically, that is accurate. And that Mary Parker Follett and her writing occurred before the writing of a lot of the human relations authors, such as Mayo and Roethlisberger and others, that we have become so familiar with. So a lot of people consider her pre-human relations. I kind of lump her in with human relations because a lot of the theories that she was talking about and writing about in the 1920s, the 1930s, were theories that were then later postulated by people like Mayo and Roethlisberger without a lot of evidence that Mayo and Roethlisberger knew about Mary Parker Follett or read any of her theories. It's just that she was a pioneer. And she was postulating these theories well before a lot of the human relations theorists did. I really like Mary Parker Follett primarily for that reason, is that she was very much of a pioneer. When you look at the period of time when Mary Parker Follett was writing, she was writing at the heyday of scientific management. So she was writing in that period of time where scientific management was rampant across the private sector and had started to be incorporated into public sector organizations as well. So there are very few people at that time who are willing to stand up and offer a lot of criticisms to scientific management. Mary Parker Follett was kind of that lone voice in the wilderness for a while, speaking out about the dehumanizing aspect of scientific management. And so since she was kind of that pioneer and since she was a female writing in the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of her male contemporaries didn't really pay a lot of attention to what she was saying and what she was writing. But a lot of those criticisms that she lodged when she was writing are the same criticisms that human relations theorists would lodge against the classical school decades later. So I like that she's a pioneer. I like that she had the fortitude to actually stand up and point out these flaws in scientific management. And the primary flaw in scientific management, again, was this idea of the dehumanizing aspect. As we talked about last week, Frederick Taylor referred to employees as cogs in the machinery, referred to employees as being boorish beasts, and that's the actual term from his writings. Mary Parker Follett had a problem with that. Mary Parker Follett felt that it was dehumanizing, and instead of only looking at the micro level, she wanted to also look at the macro level. She wanted to look at the micro level as well. Because remember, the classical school is very much focused on the macro level, the organization itself. Now, Mary Parker Follett wants to start look at the micro level of the organization, looking at individual employees and the roles that they play within the organization. Another reason why I like Mary Parker Follett a lot is because she likened organizations to democracies. And she talked a lot about democratic organizations. Now, you're not going to hear Weber and Taylor and the classical authors talk at all about democratic organizations, but Follett did. And I like that because it kind of merges this view of organization theory with the world of political science. And so when you think about a democracy, what is a democracy? Give me a definition of democracy.
It would be everybody has an equal voice, or everyone has an opportunity to voice their opinion and have that be voted upon.
Right, exactly. Everyone has a voice and everyone has an avenue to express their opinion. Democracies are really predicated upon participation. And our system of government is really a democratic republic. And we're a democratic republic, we're a democracy because we do have some avenues for direct participation. We all live here in California, and we know here in California, as voters, we can actually offer initiatives to then be placed on the ballot, and then we as voters can vote directly on those initiatives. Whenever we amend our constitution here in California, which we have done, by the way, over 500 times. State of California has the longest, most detailed constitution, not only in the US, but perhaps in the entire world. We have, I believe it's 35 articles and over 500 amendments to the California Constitution. A lot of those amendments to the California Constitution come directly from initiatives that have been placed upon the ballot. And so if you want to put an issue on the ballot, you go out there and circulate petitions. If you get the requisite number of signatures, which typically is 8% of the number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election, you then send those signatures, that petition, to the Secretary of State. Secretary of State then reviews that petition to make sure that the signatures are valid. If you meet your threshold for the number of valid signatures, then that initiative will then be scheduled to be placed upon the ballot at a future election. That's why we vote on so many propositions when we go to the ballot box, especially in even numbered years. So that's an aspect of direct democracy. We can put issues on the ballot, we can vote directly on those issues. So that makes us a democracy. We're also a constitutional republic, in that the powers and duties of the different levels of government and the relationship between people and their government, those relationships are spelled out in a contract or a constitution. We're a constitutional republic because we elect people, as we all know, to go and represent us in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento and Long Beach City Council and on our school boards. So we're electing representatives, which makes us a Republican form of government as well. So we are a democratic republic, but we do have those democracy elements in our system of government. Follett was very interested in those democratic elements and really felt that we could operate our organizations as democratic organizations, which means that the way we run our organizations will be predicated upon participation, just like the system of democracy is predicated upon participation as well. The problem, though, that Follett points out to us is there are two fundamental flaws of a representative bureaucracy, a democratic republic like what we have in this country. The two primary flaws are particularized interests and passivity of citizens. So the first one, particularized interests. She was very much writing in the same vein as James Madison, the author of the Constitution. And I'm sure that you've read at least some of the Federalist Papers. You've probably read Federalist Paper number 10, where Madison talks about the problem of factions. Particularized interests are essentially factions, that people will have specific interests that will oftentimes run counter to the specific interests of other people in other groups. And if you remember back to your reading of Federalist number 10, Madison basically tells us that there are two ways that we can deal with factions, two ways we can deal with these groups with particularized interests. One way we can do it is by eliminating them. Well, when you eliminate factions, you're eliminating democracy. So it's not possible to eliminate factions. So the second way, and the only practical way that we can deal with factions, these particularized interests, is by balancing one group against another, to do what Madison calls controlling their effects. So you can control the effects of your factions by balancing one faction against another. That helps us avoid tyranny, tyranny of the minority and tyranny of the majority. And so we balance these factions. Follett was keenly aware that if our organizations are democratic organizations, and we're allowing people to have a voice in their self-governance within our organizations. We know that people are going to have particularized interests that are going to come into conflict with each other. So we have to find a way that we can balance those conflicts. Then the second major problem with a representative democracy is the passivity of citizens. And I think she's really hitting the nail on the head here. When you think about how we tend to participate in our own governance in our system of a democratic republic, we usually pursue the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance for participation, obviously, is voting. There are other forms of participation as well. If we want to, we can donate money to candidates and to causes. We can volunteer to work on campaigns. We can run for office ourselves. We can engage in political discourse with others. There are a lot of other things that we can do to participate in our own governance, but those tend to be resource-intensive types of endeavors. Voting is not very resource-intensive at all. It doesn't take very long, and especially here in the state of California, with our new approach of giving absentee mail-in ballots to every single registered Californian, it's really lowered the burden for voting. And so it creates very passive citizens. And it's the same type of thing in our organizations, that our employees tend toward passivity. And so we need to do things in order to encourage them to participate in their own governance within these organizations. And the primary way to rectify the flaws of particularized interests and passivity among citizens is through communication and participation, fostering participation and the development of power on the part of our individual employees. Again, that is very far afield from what we heard from Max Weber and Frederick Taylor. So we've got these particularized interests that operate very much like factions would operate in a democratic form of government. These particularized interests, obviously, once you encourage their participation, they are then going to come into conflict with each other. And just like conflict is a natural artifact of a democratic system of government, conflict is also a natural artifact of a democratic organization. So she assumes that conflict will occur. Conflict is not necessarily unhealthy. Conflict can be healthy in an organization if you deal with it in the appropriate manner. She says there are basically three ways in which an organization can deal with conflict. One way is through domination. One group or individual wins, the other group or individual loses. One group dominates the other group. That is the worst way, according to Follett, to deal with conflict, because obviously the losers in that power struggle are going to be disaffected, they're going to lose their agency, and they're probably not going to be supportive of whatever decision the winners decide to pursue. So it's the single worst way to deal with conflict. The second way to deal with conflict is obviously compromise and negotiation. That is better than domination, but it is still not the ideal approach to dealing with conflict. Because in compromise, what we end up doing is we'll end up giving something up. One party gives up something, the other party gives up something, and so neither party is entirely satisfied with the resolution. The most appropriate, and I'll hesitate to use the word best in this class, but the most appropriate way to deal with conflict, according to Follett, is through integration. In integration, we allow people and we allow groups to exchange ideas. It's kind of what Theodore Lowy, a very famous political scientist, you refer to as the marketplace of ideas. He said our democratic system is a marketplace of ideas. People can go into that marketplace and they can then share ideas, they can trade ideas. That's the type of thing that Follett is talking about here in our organizations. By sharing these ideas, we can then come up with a new approach. So instead of just through compromise, both parties give something up, through integration, we can share these ideas, and then we can take these ideas and synthesize them into a new solution that all parties can get on board with and can agree to, because they have a vested interest. They have what economists would say some sunk cost into the creation of that resolution. Essentially, whenever people communicate with each other and participate through this process, there is an interpenetration of ideas between individuals. That interpenetration then leads to this integration, this synthesizing of information into a new way of dealing with the problem or answering the question. That is the most appropriate way of dealing with conflict in an organization. That is certainly the warm and fuzzy way of dealing with conflict in an organization, but we've probably all witnessed conflict within our organizations on an everyday basis, and sometimes conflict is not easily resolved through integration and interpenetration, especially when we have to make decisions very quickly. We have a very challenging dynamic environment that our organization has to adapt to very quickly. Sometimes we don't have the time for the participation necessary to make integration and interpenetration of ideas possible. But again, it is a much of a different approach than what we saw with the classical theorists. It's not this top-down commanding approach. It's more participation and communication. That ability of employees to engage in integration and interpenetration of ideas, their ability to do that is really based upon their development of power and resources. And again, have the agency to be able to engage in those types of discussions and that type of a discourse. For Follett, it was the job of leaders and managers to help develop the power and resources of their employees. For Follett, power was not something to be given to a subordinate. Rather, power was something to be developed within that subordinate. And it was a leader's job not to delegate power, but rather to help the employee build their own resources and build their own power repository, if you will. It's what she referred to as the power with approach, which is much different than the power over approach that we saw with the classical theorists that we talked about last week. So again, this power is something to be developed. It's not something to be delegated or given. It's power with as opposed to power over. So this idea of a democratic organization really led Mary Parker Follett to the realization that we can develop some principles. And that probably sounds familiar to you because it's like the principal school last week, but we can develop some principles of organization to help guide us in how we structure and manage our organizations. One principle of organization, according to Follett, is coordination. You engage in coordination through integration between departments and individuals. In modern day organizations, this is like cross-functionality and cross-training where everyone in the organization can learn what others in the organization are doing so that you can coordinate efforts. This is what she's talking about, coordination through integration. A second principle is early contact. That leaders and managers must make contact very early on with their employees. They need to reach out to their employees. They need to treat their employees as human beings. They need to understand the wants, needs, and desires of those employees. And they need to do that very, very early on in their tenure as a leader or a manager. You need to be able to take all perspectives into account. This eventually, several years later, or several decades later, really ties in nicely with a theory known as groupthink. And you may have talked about groupthink in previous courses, but Janice's groupthink occurs when you have groups that are unwilling to take other perspectives into account. That's what Follett tells us we need to try and avoid. So she was decades ahead of Janice and his theory of groupthink. We have to take all other perspectives into account because only through that can we end up having interpenetration, which then will lead to integration of ideas. We need to recognize that coordination is dynamic, that it's going to change with the situation. Mary Parker Follett was very well known for her idea of leading by the situation. It's dynamic, different contexts and different situations will call for different approaches to coordination. But these are the principles that Follett felt if we incorporate within our organization, we could then make our organizations democratic organizations, which would then allow us to encourage participation on our employees and allow our employees to participate in their own self-direction and their own self-governance. That then allows us to get around those fundamental flaws, such as passivity of citizens and the conflict that comes with particularized interests. So for Follett, her view of organizational effectiveness really favors 3 of our 4 models, very much in line with the human relations approach to measuring organizational effectiveness, the creation of cohesion, the building of morale among our employees, very much in line with the internal process model because she really focused within the organization, and very much in line with the rational goal model as well. Now, that could be somewhat surprising, but the reason why the rational goal model is also emphasized by Follett is because Follett, even though she was talking about the micro level approach of focusing on individual employees and taking their wants, needs, and desires into account, she was doing it for a purpose. And the purpose of creating a democratic organization was to achieve the goals of the organization. So the ultimate goal was the goal of the organization. And so that's kind of a similarity we saw with the classical school. And I think that's why the rational goal model is one of the 3 models emphasized by Mary Parker Follett. The only one that's not really emphasized by Follett is the open systems model, because she really didn't talk a whole lot about the environment around the organization. She really was focusing internal to the organization, creating this coordination type of system, creating participation and vertical as well as horizontal communication within the organization. Where Follett really parts company with our classical theorists is in terms of the mechanisms for control and coordination. Rather than direct supervision for Follett, it was mutual adjustment. And with mutual adjustment, we're talking about allowing, again, agency for our employees to participate in their own self-governance. As Tompkins refers to it, workers consult with each other informally about what needs to be accomplished and how responsibility for coordination and control rests with those who will be doing the work. So again, it's not this, we tell you what to do and you do it. How it gets done, really, that decision really rests with the employees who are doing that work on a daily basis, and they communicate and they work with each other. Again, another way that we see Mary Parker Follett part company with the classical school is also in terms of the motivational strategies that she favors. Motivational strategies she favors: considerate leadership, group acceptance, and job identification. Considerate leadership, taking into account the wants, needs, and desires of employees. Group acceptance, realizing that groups exist in our organizations and they can be formal as well as informal groups. And sometimes those informal groups are just as important as the formal groups that have standing within our organizational structure. And then job identification. The more people can identify with the jobs that they are doing, the more likely they are to be motivated to be productive and to contribute to the goals of the organization. So with Mary Parker Follett and her idea of a democratic organization, you can see a lot of differences with the classical school, but the primary goal still remains trying to achieve the stated goals of the organization. It's just we achieve those stated goals differently in a democratic organization than we would have done in scientific management or in Weber's ideal bureaucratic structure. Rather than being a commanding top-down type of approach, it's based more on mutual adjustment and considerate leadership, but it's still being done for the purpose of achieving the goals of the organization. But again, I think that Mary Parker Follett is one of the more layered authors that we cover in this class, because there are a lot of layers to her work. There are a lot of levels to her theories, more so than some of the other folks that we're going to talk about later on in the class. And so again, that's another reason why I tend to be a big fan of Mary Parker Follett. Again, we talked about Mary Parker Follett as being a pre-human relations theorist because she was really writing years before most of the other human relations theorists developed similar types of theories. And some of those later human relations theorists that developed somewhat similar theories to Mary Parker Follett are people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger. Now, Elton Mayo, I'm sure you have been exposed to before. I know you've heard about him and read about him in the 500 class. Even before that, if you've taken any classes in sociology or psychology at the undergraduate level, you've probably dealt with Elton Mayo before as well. Elton Mayo took kind of a psychological approach to understanding problems within our organizations. And so Elton Mayo talked a lot about what he referred to as social disorganization. He felt that we had a problem in our organizations. We had disorganization within our institutions, primarily because of human irrationality and the nature of the factory system itself. So by human irrationality, what he's talking about is that the Industrial Revolution forced a lot of people or induced a lot of people to leave their homes at a very young age and move to industrial centers to get jobs in these factories. That's where the money was, that's where the work was. So we had a lot of people moving off of farms and moving into industrial areas to work in factories. They were doing that at a very young age. And according to Mayo, they were doing that at 14, 15, 16 years old. They were basically leaving home before they had arrived at adulthood. So they still had a lot of psychological issues that they had not dealt with because they had not yet gone through the maturation process that all human beings go through. So when you have these young people who have now worked through these psychological issues, leaving home at an early age and going into the factory setting, it leads to what he called a lot of irrational behaviors on the part of our employees. And it was very common in the early 1900s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s for especially people on farms in the South to relocate to urban centers in the North to go and work in factories. That's kind of the story of my family. My father moved from a farm in Kentucky to go and work in the steel mills in Cleveland, Ohio, along with all of his brothers at a very young age. And I think that happened to a lot of folks. So Mayo says that human irrationality, just because of the young age of these employees and the unresolved psychological issues, really leads to a lot of disorganization, a lot of conflict and strife within our organizations. And that disorganization, that conflict, and that strife is then exacerbated by the fact that they are working in a factory system. The factory system itself really does contribute to those frustrations on the part of our employees. When you think about the working conditions of a factory, you think about how work is done in a factory, especially in an assembly line type of an approach. You've got what you call that long link type of technology. And people really oftentimes don't see the big picture of what they are doing. They have one task under task specialization. They do that same task day in and day out without really being exposed to the bigger picture of how that one task then contributes to the overall effectiveness of the organization. So what Mayo wanted to do through his experiments and through his theories was to try and deal with this human irrationality in order to make our organizations better functioning organizations and to make them better organized and to have employees who will act more rationally and contribute to the goals of the organization. So as a good social scientist, Mayo conducted a variety of different studies, the illumination studies, the relay assembly room studies, the bank wiring studies, had a whole bunch of studies that he did. The one that we usually focus on here in public administration is the Hawthorne experiment. And the Hawthorne experiments, I think, are probably the most important studies that he did. And really, he's best known for those Hawthorne experiments. You've probably read about the Hawthorne experiments before, so you're probably familiar with them, but can someone tell me about the Hawthorne experiments? What was the purpose of the Hawthorne experiments, and what did Mayo end up finding? What were his conclusions? They were done at the Hawthorne electrical plant.
Are these the ones that they turned down the lights to see what the productivity was, and then they realized that it's not necessarily the lighting?
Yep, exactly. Perfect. They decided, well, we're going to look at a physical stimulus to see what impact a physical stimulus has on the productivity of employees. So the physical stimulus they chose was the lighting level. So as a good social scientist, Mayo and his colleagues developed their hypotheses. First hypothesis was if we turn the lights up, then people will be able to see their work better. And so they'll then become more productive when the lights are raised. So they increased the lighting level, and sure enough, people were more productive. So it confirmed that hypothesis. Then they offered up a second hypothesis. Well, if we turn the lighting down, then people won't be able to see what they're doing as well, and then productivity will go down. They turned the lighting down, and productivity continued to increase, even to higher levels than when they had first turned the lighting up. So, as you said, it was not the lighting level, it was not that physical stimulus that was having a positive impact upon productivity. What was having a positive impact on productivity was the recognition on the part of these employees that they're being paid attention to. You know, these researchers were talking to them. They were asking them about their experiences. They were paying attention to them from one of the first times in their career in this factory. And so they really responded positively because of that, to that social stimulus. So it wasn't really a physical stimulus. They're reacting to that social stimulus. They also found out that people, when they were placed in groups, there was a lot of group pressure that was being placed upon members of groups. And so if you had a group of 5 people and one person wasn't carrying their weight, making the other 4 people look bad, the other 4 people would then pressure that person to work harder, to be more productive, so the entire group would look good. So really the 2 main things that we take away from the Hawthorne experiments, number one, what came to be known as the Hawthorne effect. And you talk about the Hawthorne effect a lot in research. People tend to behave and act differently when they are being observed. And they react differently because they're being paid attention to. It's kind of that social element. The second main takeaway from the Hawthorne experiments, the importance of these groups. That people form groups, sometimes informal groups, and those informal groups can have profound impacts upon the productivity of employees. So it really recognizes the social aspect of an organization. Recognizing the social aspect of an organization is somewhat similar to what Mary Parker Follett talked to us about, but it's much different than what we heard from our classical theorists like Weber and Taylor. So we now start to recognize in human relations theory the importance of social interactions. And Fritz Roethlisberger, a student of Elton Mayo, took those findings and then took them to develop a new discipline. And Roethlisberger argued that we need a new discipline in order to understand the social aspects of an organization. This new discipline of organization theory, according to Roethlisberger, should focus, number one, on communication problems, identifying problems, communicating between employees, between managers and employees, and then rectifying those problems. That should sound familiar because that was one of the major principles in Mary Parker Follett's democratic organizations. Secondly, this new discipline should focus on getting the cooperation of employees rather than commanding and directing employees in a very micromanagement type of orientation, what to do and how to do it. Instead, we need to gain their compliance. We need to work on getting their cooperation for achieving organizational goals. And the third aspect of this new discipline, according to Roethlisberger, was to generate this focus on maintaining individual and organizational equilibrium through change. It really focuses on finding that balance, that organizational harmony within our organizations. Finding that equilibrium, finding that balance is a theme that we're going to pick up on next week when we talk about systems theory. And next week, when we talk about systems theory, we'll introduce the idea of homeostasis. And homeostasis is this equilibrium, this balance. Sometimes it's a balance within the organization. Sometimes it's finding your balance or equilibrium between the organization and its environment. But Roethlisberger, well before the systems theorists, started talking about finding this equilibrium as one of the primary goals of this creation of a new discipline of organization theory and behavior. But Roethlisberger and Mayo taken together really do emphasize this idea of the social nature of organizations. Our organizations are not just about command and control. They're not just about our organizational structures. They are really very much social systems. They are social systems that have informal elements alongside the formal elements. There are informal groups that are just as important as some of the formal work groups that are created within our formal organizational structure. Now, obviously, this is an important contribution to human relations theory, because once you start viewing your organizations as social systems, that means that we're going to have to start paying more attention to our employees. We're going to have to pay more attention to how our employees are interacting with each other, that kind of more micro as opposed to macro level approach to organization theory. And we also have to pay attention to how our employees are interacting with the organization. That kind of gets us more toward the third approach to organization theory, which is a management-based approach. And this is really what starts to move us from the macro to the micro to the management approach to studying organizations. But that's the big takeaway of Mayo and Roethlisberger, the whole idea of an organization as a social system. Another human relations theorist is Chester Barnard. And Barnard is an interesting one, because Barnard is someone we talk about this week with human relations theory, but he's also someone that we talk about next week with systems theory. So he has applicability both this week as well as next week. But for this week, since we're talking about human relations theory, Barnard's primary contribution to human relations theory is his recognition that the success of leaders and managers is based upon their ability to get the compliance on the part of their employees. That again, it's no longer a situation where you can just direct people, tell them this is what you do and expect them to do it. Instead, to be successful and achieve the goals of the organization, you must lead through compliance. You must get people to comply and provide contributions to the organization to help you achieve organizational goals. For Chester Barnard, his view of the organizational system was very much of a transactional one. It was transactional in that leaders and managers provide incentives to their employees, and those incentives will then induce employees to then provide contributions back to the organization. This is this whole idea of equity theory, that employees will only be satisfied if what they are getting out of their efforts will at least be equal to what they're putting in terms of contributions. So managers and leaders need to find the right set of incentives to get the right types of contributions from their employees. That means that leaders and managers need to know their employees. They need to know what their employees value. For every reward or incentive that is given to an employee will place what is called a valence level on that incentive. The valence level is the value that they place upon it. So for some folks, they will place a very high value on recognition. So being recognized as employee of the week will be a very big deal to them, and they'll have a very high valence level for being employee of the week. For others, they don't care a bit about being employee of the week. Maybe getting a perk like a better office is something that's a strong incentive for them, and that then has a high valence level. But it's important for managers and leaders to know the valence levels that employees place upon all these different incentives, then provide the right mixture of incentives to then get the contributions necessary to make the organization effective. So you need to know your employees and know their valence levels on all these different incentives. You also need to know your employees, according to Barnard, because of what he calls their zones of indifference. So Barnard makes the argument that every employee will have a different, what he calls, zone of indifference. If you ask an employee to do something, to take an action that violates their code of ethics, that violates their values, they're probably going to push back and give a lot of resistance to doing that. However, if you ask someone to do something that doesn't violate their values and you're compensating them accordingly, you're probably going to get their compliance. They're going to acquiesce and they're probably going to do it. So Barnard says the most effective leaders and managers are the ones who know how to operate within their employees' zone of indifference. As long as you're in that zone of indifference and you're not asking someone to do something that violates their ethical and their ethical principles and their values, you're going to have a much easier time getting their acquiescence and getting their compliance. Once you step outside of that zone of indifference, that's where you'll no longer get their compliance. And again, leaders and managers, to be effective, need to get the compliance on the part of their employees. So when you add up this whole idea of knowing the valence levels of your employees to having to know and needing to know the zones of indifference for your employees, you need to talk to your employees. You need to know your employees. You need to interact with your employees. You need to interact with your employees for the purpose of achieving organizational goals. So in a way, it is an advancement on the classical school, because here we are saying you got to talk to your employees. You have to take that micro level type of an approach, but you're doing it to achieve organizational goals. You're not doing it to necessarily achieve the goals of your individual employees. And so there's still, it kind of still smacks of that classical macro approach of trying to achieve the goals of the organization as opposed to helping employees achieve their individual goals. But when you take Elton Mayo and you combine him together with Fritz Roethlisberger and you combine him together with Chester Barnard, it then creates this thing we call human relations theory. And human relations theory is very much alive and well in our modern organizations. If you look at your organization, you're probably going to see things such as counseling programs. Your organization probably has an employee assistance program, an EAP. EAPs are artifacts of this human relations approach to managing organizations. You probably have a system of training and development, PD, that's provided to employees. Those PD systems are, again, artifacts of the human relations approach to managing organizations. But again, the criticism that's lodged against human relations theory is that it was somewhat exploitative, in that it was still trying to exploit the efforts of employees to achieve the goals of the organization. So it is movement and it is progress away from the classical school, but we're still focusing on the ultimate goals of the organization. We're still really seeing how we can manipulate, I know manipulate's a bad term, but how we can manipulate the behaviors of our employees to then achieve the goals of the organization. Clearly, as Tompkins tells us, the primary model of organizational effectiveness is the human relations model. I would part company with Tompkins, though, and say that there is still a rational goal aspect to Mayo, Roethlisberger, Barnard, the traditional human relations theorists, because they are still taking that macro approach of trying to achieve the goals of the organization. So when shading that chart on page 175, I would shade the human relations cell darker than the rational goal cell, but I still think the rational goal model has some applicability in human relations theory. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, that still is direct supervision, much more so than what we saw with Mary Parker Follett. You get to know your employees, you need to know what your employees value, but again, it's all for the purpose of achieving the goals of the organization. So there still is that centralization, that top-down type of an orientation in the human relations school. In terms of our methods for motivation, considerate leadership and group acceptance. Clearly considerate leadership in that we are talking to our employees, we're interacting with our employees, we're asking them about their wants, needs, and desires, but for the purpose of achieving organizational goals. And group acceptance, we're recognizing how important groups are within our organization, both formal as well as informal groups. But as you view the human relations school, again, view it on this spectrum, in that we're starting to move away from the classical school, moving more toward a micro as opposed to macro level approach in some respects, but still the macro approaches, we're still trying to do all of this to achieve the goals of the organization. That was the primary critique of human relations theory, is that it was still somewhat top down. It was still based upon centralization. It was, for some of the stronger critics of human relations theory, it was still based upon exploitation. And so all those critiques then gave rise to another school of thought, which was human resource management theory. And again, one of the reasons why Tompkins deals with human relations and human resource management theory separately is because of chronological reasons. We cover them both tonight, but we do differentiate between our human relations theorists and our human resource management theorists. But the reason we do it is because of the focus of these theories. Whereas the human relations focus was much more of a focus on achieving organizational goals and figuring out how to get employees to contribute to the achievement of those organizational goals. In human resource management theory, now individual goals start to become as important as organizational goals. So it's no longer just about defining the goal of the organization as what the organization needs. Now we start looking at the goals of individual employees as well. I always liken it to that John F. Kennedy phrase, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This kind of similar, ask not what you can do for the organization, but also ask what the organization can do for you. In human resource management school, there is an inherent value placed upon helping employees develop as human resources. Even if developing them as human resources means that those employees are going to leave the organization, there is still inherent value in helping them develop to self-actualize and become all that they can be as human beings. So again, you can kind of see we're moving away from the macro, moving much more toward the micro type of orientation, focusing on the goals of individual employees. There are a lot of human resource management theorists that we could cover in this class, but we do have limited time and limited scope. So the three primary human resource management theorists that we'll talk about tonight: Abraham Maslow, who I'm sure you have encountered before, Douglas McGregor, and his student, Chris Argyris. So what does Abraham Maslow have to say that contributes to our understanding of human resource management theory? You're probably very familiar with Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, like you see on the screen there. Maslow believed that every individual had a hierarchy of needs. The needs at the bottom of that pyramid are what he called the deficiency needs. The ones at the top of the pyramid are what he calls the growth needs. So your primary deficiency needs are things such as, at the bottom, physiological needs, things such as food, water, warmth, rest, the basic physiological needs of a human being. That's a deficiency need, meaning that people are motivated by a deficiency in their physiological needs. And so if someone doesn't have enough food to eat, doesn't have water to drink, doesn't have a place to rest, they're going to be motivated to try and fulfill those deficiencies. Then the next level up, you have safety needs, the need to feel secure and safe. Again, those are deficiency needs. So if you don't feel secure and safe, you're going to be motivated to try and find that safety and find that security. Next level up are kind of your psychological needs. Again, still deficiency needs, belongingness and love needs. People need to feel that they belong to something bigger than themselves, that they have a friend group, that they have relationships with other people. They are going to be motivated by a deficiency if they do not have those friends and do not have those relationships. Next level up are the esteem needs, the need to feel prestige and feeling of accomplishment, to be held in high esteem by others. Again, very psychological in nature, but still somewhat of a deficiency need. That if you do not feel that you're being held in high esteem by others, you don't have that feeling of prestige, you're going to be motivated by trying to find that esteem and to be respected by others. So those are your deficiency needs. And at the apex of the pyramid is self-actualization. Self-actualization is essentially achieving one's full potential to be all that you can be as a human being. That is a growth type of need, meaning that you are not motivated by a deficiency, but rather you are motivated by the desire to grow. Self-actualization is a motivator that continues. It doesn't end. We are always constantly being motivated by our desire to grow and to be all that we can be and to self-actualize. Now, this is the traditional hierarchy of needs that gets taught in just about every organization theory class on the planet. However, we need to recognize that very late in his life, Abraham Maslow went back and revisited this hierarchy of needs and made some changes. One of the most notable changes that he made in his revised hierarchy of needs was to self-actualization. He changed self-actualization to the need to give back and be part of a community and contribute to something bigger than oneself. When Maslow went back and looked at this hierarchy of needs, he realized that these needs all focus on the individual, including self-actualization. And he felt it was kind of a selfish focus just on the individual. And he recognized that people really oftentimes want to give back to their communities, and they want to give to something bigger than what they are. This is why people volunteer and do public service without compensation, why people contribute to charities and do things such as that. That's giving back to something bigger than you, going beyond just you as an individual. So later in life, the self-actualization really became doing for others and doing for creating something, a lasting legacy that is bigger than just you as an individual. And unfortunately, a lot of courses don't recognize or talk about how Maslow went back and revised his hierarchy of needs later on in life. But the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the big so what question, well, why do we talk about it here with human resource management theory, is because it talks about these different needs on the part of employees, and that self-actualization need, becoming all that one can be, becomes a goal in and of itself that may be separate from the goal of the organization. And so in human resource management theory, we need to focus on those goals of the individual in addition to the goals of the organization. It's also important to note that Maslow pointed out that these different levels could be in a different order for different people. This is kind of his traditional approach for most people, but not everyone will have the same ordering to their hierarchy of needs, which then means it's important for leaders and managers to, again, get to know their employees, to know what deficiencies those employees are suffering from, and to hopefully be able to help those employees figure out how to achieve self-actualization, how to achieve their full potential. I think I've mentioned this class before, but it's very much in line with a motivational theory known as path goal theory. And path goal theory is a theory of motivational leadership that says leaders and managers need to identify paths for their employees to achieve their individual goals. And the better a leader or manager can remove the obstacles in the way of that employee achieving their goals, the better they can motivate that individual employee. So the importance of Maslow obviously is, again, we need to know our employees, we need to interact with our employees, we need to value our employees far more than we valued them in the classical school, and now even more than what we valued them in the human relations school. Maslow is also important because Maslow really forms the basis for the work of Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor was a big believer in Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and used that hierarchy of needs to then develop what he called the human side of the enterprise. And his most famous work, The Human Side of the Enterprise, Douglas McGregor argued that it was important for organizations to treat their employees as creative and intelligent human beings, and to try and remove some of the obstacles for these intelligent human beings to achieve their goals and to self-actualize. As you probably know from your 500 class, Douglas McGregor is best known for his theory X versus theory Y. Theory X viewed employees as being very unintelligent, as being not very creative, as not being very motivated to work, not very innovative. It was a very negative view of individual human beings. Theory Y was just the opposite of that. So whereas theory X said people were not intelligent, theory Y says people are inherently intelligent. Theory X said people are not creative, theory Y says people are creative. Theory X says people don't want to work. Theory Y says that work is as natural of a motivation as leisure or play. So it's a much more positive view of employees. Well, so what? The so what is that McGregor argued that the majority of our employees are theory Y employees. Now, he admits not all of our employees are theory Y. We've got some theory X employees thrown in there as well. But the vast majority of our employees tend to be theory Y employees. They tend to be these very creative, very innovative types of people who want to grow, who want to assume accountability and responsibility. The problem, though, is that the majority of our employees are theory Y, but McGregor says the majority of our organizations are theory X. Essentially shoehorning theory Y employees into theory X organizations. Our organizations are theory X because they are still structured in the classical type of an approach. They're still structured in all those elements of the ideal bureaucracy. They still have that top-down type of management that we get from Frederick Taylor and the principal school. Classical theory X organizations are doing a disservice to our theory Y employees. So McGregor said it's incumbent upon organizations to transition from theory Y to the theory X to theory Y organizations. And the way in which organizations can transition from theory X to theory Y are by engaging in things such as job enrichment, where they allow employees to self-govern and self-determine a lot of the tasks that they do on a daily basis. Organizations allow employees to help put together their position descriptions, to help determine what types of training and development programs they will be exposed to, and to give that type of self-direction for employees, as opposed to having the top-down type of centralization that we normally see in a theory X type of organization. But it's the job of the organization to transform to meet the needs and the desires of those theory Y types of employees. What McGregor has basically done with his human side of the enterprise is he has taken the classical school and he has completely flipped it on its head. So instead of saying we're going to take this macro level approach, what's in the best interest of the organization, now we're going to say we're going to take that micro level approach and even a management approach whereby we look at how individuals interact with their organizations, and we need to transform our organizations to make them easier for people to achieve their self-actualization. So it's a complete different approach than what we saw with the classical school. And Chris Argyris, who is a student of Douglas McGregor, then took McGregor's theories and ran with them. And what Chris Argyris did is he took this whole idea of theory Y employees and he developed it into what he called his personal growth maturation process. And Argyris believed that all individuals go through this maturation process of personal growth. That as people age, they mature, and as they mature, they go through this process of growth. This personal growth process consists of people increasing their activism. They become more active in their own self-determination. They become more active in their careers. They become more active in their communities. So you've got this increasing activism, this desire to be more active. Ardra says as people go through this maturation process, they also increase their independence. They become more independent, more able to work independently without supervision, without a lot of micromanagement. As people go through maturation, this personal growth, they develop the ability to behave in multiple different ways. That there are different ways they behave, just not one method of behavior. They can behave in a multitude of different ways. They develop deepening interests, that their interests are not nearly as superficial as they used to be. They're not just interested in a title or interested in money. They're interested in deeper things. They're interested in making a difference and making a change. They take on a longer term time perspective. So whereas they used to be more concerned about tomorrow, now they're more concerned about 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. These employees, as they go through their personal growth, they're also much more likely to aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to supervisory positions because they are seeking out that responsibility. They want to have that responsibility and that accountability that perhaps they shunned earlier on in their career. They also develop self-awareness and emotional maturity and emotional intelligence as they go through this personal growth process. The problem, just like what McGregor told us, Ardra says the problem is that classic organization theory inhibits this personal growth process. That we need to have theory Y organizations that can foster this personal growth, as opposed to theory X organizations that will inhibit that personal growth. And so again, for Ardra, like with McGregor, it's incumbent upon the organization through things like job enrichment, job enlargement, to allow people and afford them the opportunities to develop the skills and the resources that they want to develop as individual human beings. The goals of the individual now become as important as the goals of the organization. So the ultimate goal, no pun intended, is somewhat different in the human resource management approach as compared to the human relations approach. So in terms of human resource management, people like Maslow and McGregor and Ardra, where do they fit in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness? Well, clearly human relations approach, clearly internal process approach, and clearly rational goal. But the difference here is that, again, the rational goal, the goal can be an individual goal and not necessarily an organizational goal like it was with human relations and with the classical school. In terms of our methods for coordination control, we are very squarely in the world of mutual adjustment. And mutual adjustment, again, that's where workers consult with each other. They consult with management in self-determining what they do on a daily basis, as opposed to just being told what to do through direct supervision. And in terms of our motivational strategies, job identification is the primary motivational strategy, that we can motivate people by allowing them to design their own jobs so that they identify with those jobs. The more they identify with those jobs, the more likely they will be to be productive and develop their own skills and resources, human resources. So again, what we have seen is we have seen this transition, this movement, gradual movement away from the classical top-down approach to a much more bottom-up approach, valuing human beings and helping human beings along the way in their personal growth journey. The difference, though, as we said, between human relations and human resource management is that in human resource management, the goal is both individual as well as organizational, as opposed to human relations, where the goal was to achieve the goals of the organization and to find ways to get people to comply and contribute to that productivity and those goals for the organization. So at this point, let's take a little break and ask the question, do you have any questions about any of these theorists or how we have moved from the classical to the human relations to the School of Human Resource Management. Any questions or clarifications? Okay. If not, then let's go ahead and take our evening break. I know it's a little early, but we'll go ahead and take our evening break. And then after the break, we'll come back and then I have an exercise that we can do in our breakout rooms. And then once we're done with our breakout rooms, we'll then assess how we're doing on time. And then we will decide whether or not we want to work ahead a little bit, but we'll see how that goes after we're done with our breakout rooms. So it is 7:10. So let's take our normal 15-minute break. So come on back at 7:25. I'll put you into the breakout rooms and we'll talk about the exercise we're going to do. And then we'll do that exercise, reconvene as a class, share the results from our groups, and then we will take it from there. So come on back at 7:25 and we'll do our breakout groups. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. I see we're down a few folks, but that seems to be par for the course after our first half of the class. It seems like that happens each week. So I think we're down to 12. So when we do our breakout groups, we'll probably just do 3 breakout groups. I think that would probably make a little bit more sense than doing 4 with our limited numbers. So the assignment in the breakout groups is a pretty straightforward one, kind of similar to what we've done in the past. For this one, each room should explore the aspects of Fault and Mayo that you see within your organizations, identify at least one aspect of Fault's theory, one aspect of Mayo's theory, evident in your organizations. You can also, if you'd like, add on McGregor in there as well, if you would like, since we did spend some time talking about McGregor. As always, each room can select a colleague to share the room's findings with the class. So let me start up our breakout rooms. And we'll do 3 breakout rooms tonight. I'll just automatically assign. So our rooms are set up. We'll call it about 30 minutes, but we'll see if groups are finishing up earlier. Just, let me know. And we can always cut it a little bit early, but we'll say about 30 minutes in our breakout rooms, and then we will reconvene as a class. So let me open up the rooms, and then you will be able to get to work. So here we go. Okay, rooms are open. Okay, I think all of our groups are done. Everyone's back. So let's go ahead and reconvene and see what you came up with. So we'll start with room number 1.
Okay, we're a group 1. We came up with the one of Folle's theory. The principle of an organization is, I work for the state, and we have many disciplines. So we have to take into consideration all perspectives and work together and coordinate together in order to kind of to head towards the missions and of the state's goals. And then for Mayo, we definitely all agreed that when there's an inclusive management and management is involved with their employees, they definitely work harder when there's a cohesive team versus team management that's not involved. So we agreed on that as well. Those are the 2 perspectives that we agreed upon.
Okay, good. Thanks, Michael. And I think an important point is larger organizations, the larger and the more heterogeneous the organization, sometimes obviously the more difficult it is to coordinate. So those principles of coordination can certainly be difficult when you have a very large organization. So, and in terms of the inclusivity of management, whenever management is involved, obviously it serves for role modeling. There is a motivational theory known as social learning. And in social learning, employees take cues from leaders and managers. And so the more involved managers are, and the less proximity there is, the more proximity there is between managers and employees, the better employees are to pick up on those clues that are being given to them by management. So easier for them to engage in that social learning type of cognitive theory. So, okay, good. Room number 2.
I believe that was us. I was with Josefina and Allegra,
Okay.
and we all agreed that we do view aspects of Follett's and Mayo's organizational theories in our respective agencies. Allegra mentioned that since employees work from home now, there is more of a shift in management style towards the employees, as opposed to the past where everyone was stuck in an office and it was readily available for managers to call up meetings or micromanage the people, their subordinates. Basically, they now heavily depend on employees to be and remain productive from a distance. So this has led to a leadership that is focused more so on motivating their employees and making sure that they feel valued, as opposed to cracking down on them. Josefina mentioned that in her agency, there is more of an approach where employees are encouraged to be part of special teams. So we can see both theories basically trying to engage the employees, trying to keep them productive and happy. And then in my agency, it's since it's law enforcement, there is a high rate of suicides, but ever since the pandemic, the suicides spiked quite significantly, and it led to even in an agency where it's law enforcement, where it's for the longest time it's been a hierarchy. There is somewhat of a shift now that simulates more of Follett's and Mayo's theories, where they're trying to keep the employees engaged, they're trying to make them feel valued, and it's sort of a response to the spike in suicides, to the officers that are leaving because they feel disengaged, they feel unhappy with the agency. So I never thought I would see it within a law enforcement agency where change is it's somewhat stubborn, and for the longest time it's been a hierarchy. I can see aspects of both Follett's and Mayo's theories as well.
Thanks, Adolfo. And that is really interesting that, like you said, in paramilitary organizations, we tend to see them trend much more along the lines of classical organization theory. It is interesting that you've seen more Follett and Mayo and human relations and human resource management theory, even in a paramilitary organization. And the impact of remote work has certainly been profound. You know, we could spend an entire class talking about the impacts of remote work on organizations, but it is interesting to see that one of the artifacts of remote work has been more of a movement toward HR orientation on the part of managers, because they are working at a distance with their employees. And so it's important that they motivate those employees to make sure those employees remain productive in ways that they're not able, that they would normally do on in person, they're no longer able to do in a remote work environment. And so I think that's really a fascinating observation, and something that I think could be an important topic, a research topic for the literature, to see what that impact of remote work has been in terms of HR types of orientations on the part of leaders and managers. So I think that could be a fascinating research topic. So great. Thank you for that. And group number 3.
Hello. Group number 3. It was myself, Melissa, and Cynthia in the group. I worked for a city, and I felt like I related more towards I'm sorry, I drawing a blank here. I'm sorry. Let me review I actually clicked off my screen. I apologize. Float's view of power. When it spoke on coordinating through integration between departments and individuals, I kind of related that towards my city, where not only are we kind of based strictly on our department, but we do work with others. We take into account all perspectives. So when we're planning, we reassess everyone's thoughts, ideas before we coordinate and move forward. And it is more so of an internal process to reach that goal. When it came to Mayo's, Melissa mentioned about in her organization, there's a lot of cross training opportunities that's very unique. And, you know, it's just providing the workers with like a better environment, and not that it's mainly money based, but also take into account what employees would like to learn, keeping the employees happy. And that's kind of how we had it related to our organizations.
Thank you, Jesse. And yeah, I think that cross-training, cross-functionality, we saw it in the private sector, and now it's started to creep into the public sector as well. And I know Honda, for many years, they would do the cross-training and cross-functionality, and they would have 1 day per week where different employees would then try out different jobs, and you would have people from the assembly line that would go up into the management suites, and people from the management suites going down onto the assembly line. So everyone could see what everyone else does and how everything works together in achieving organizational goals. And one of the nice things about that type of orientation is that it really does enhance goal congruence. And goal congruence is something that's difficult for organizations, where you can find that point whereby individual goals and organizational goals can come into sync with each other. And that's it's an important part of organizational harmony, but it's an extremely difficult thing to try and achieve. I think that, you know, one of the things when we look at some of these HR theories, especially in Mary Parker Follett, it sounds really good in the classroom. It makes a lot of sense in the classroom, but sometimes we have limitations in terms of just how well we can implement that in organizations on a daily basis. A lot of organizations face very challenging and dynamic environments, and they have to be adaptive to those dynamic environments. And sometimes they have to make decisions very, very quickly. And you just don't have the time or the luxury to have that type of integration and interpenetration of ideas that Follett talks about. And so, again, it's always that challenge that we have in these types of programs, where we have to try and take classroom theories and apply them in practice. And sometimes that nexus is somewhat difficult to find. But it is good to see that you have some good tangible examples of Follett, Mayo, and some of our HR theorists in your modern day organizations. So I'll stop there because I don't want to take too much time from you this evening. And we don't really have time to move forward into systems theory. So we'll just hold that in abeyance until next week. Next week, what we'll do is we'll talk about systems theory. We'll go through natural systems and open systems theory. And then I think we'll probably have some time remaining. So we'll work ahead into some of our more modern organization theories as well, do some breakout groups. Then when we get to week number 5 and 6, we're going to start targeting more of those presentations. And so give some thought in terms of your presentation of your organizational analysis paper, whether you would like to be one of maybe 4 or 5 people who are willing and able to do it in week 5 versus waiting to do it in week 6 or in our last Saturday session. So if there's anyone who would like to go first on those presentations in week 5, we should be able to accommodate about 4 or 5 people time-wise in week 5, and then wrap up the rest of the presentations on week 6 and then the final Saturday session if necessary. So that's all I have for you tonight. So thanks for being here. Thanks again for hanging around for our breakout groups. I know that a lot of colleagues did it, and so I do appreciate you hanging around to do the application in those breakout groups. I also look forward to reading your Canvas essay number 3. So I'll get the feedback on those back to you as soon as possible. And then we'll be back at it again next Wednesday with systems theory. So thanks, everyone. Have a great night, great remainder of your week, and I'll talk to you then next Wednesday.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Poe.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Take care.